Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first ever dive into the world of King Crimson. It's a world full of dark, jazzy, progressive rock and a ton of experimentation. Today we're beginning with one of their more experimental records that features two percussionists, a violinist, and a lot of free jazz improvisation. As drummer Bill Bruford would put it, the world of King Crimson is a terrifying, terrifying place. Stay tuned. So Isaac, do you recall your introduction to King Crimson?
Vaguely. Oh, yes, yeah. I believe, you introduced me with Court of the Crimson King.
Of course. It's a natural first starting point. I remember I was in my usual record haunt, my usual CD music shop, and I remember I saw In the Court of the Crimson King and three other King Crimson albums there. And I hadn't really heard of King Crimson at that point, and the guy who owned the shop said, he's like, hey man, these are rare. I'd snap them all up when you got a chance. King Crimson's some good shit. And I was like, okay, I'll get this first one. And so I grabbed it In the Court because that's the famous one, right? And I brought it home, listened to it. Next day, first thing in the morning, I freaking ran back down there and got the other three because I knew I was onto something here. So King Crimson, hopefully for people who know at least a thing or two about progressive rock, do not need much of an introduction. This is one of the most famous and revered bands of the genre for multiple reasons. I mean, the lineup changes, they've gone through the different incarnations, they've gone through the influence on the genre. In the Court of the Crimson King is often considered the first proper progressive rock record. And of course, you could spend a lot of time talking about any single one of their records, and we're going to do a really big conversation about that first one at some point on this channel. But today we're going to talk about their fifth LP, Larks Tongues and Aspic, which was also the second one I decided to hear because I like the cover, I like the name, I guess. And as far as the cover, Isaac, do you know the origin of the cover? What that actually means?
Well, I've seen images of like sun and moon together, but not in the way it's displayed here and it's arranged here. So please inform me of the cover.
So interestingly enough, I first of all, that cover is great. It's just so simple but so evocative. It's a cool symbol. I've seen it on t-shirts the band's made. It's great. But Larks Tongues, of course, being the tongues of birds, and Aspic is a kind of pudding. So it's basically the title of this record is basically Larks Tongues and Pudding. Appetizing, right? Anyway, Larks Tongues is one of the band's more revered records, and it's also the band's second incarnation. So King Crimson, as I mentioned already, have had a lot of lineup changes, a lot of different band members over the years. I think they rival Megadeth and even Iced Earth in that department. But the cool thing is, with every different incarnation of the band, they've had a totally different sound. So Larks Tongues and Aspic was their fifth record. The four before had more of a consistent sound going through, and this one they completely started from scratch. They have a new bass vocalist John Wetton, who would then become the lead vocalist of Asia. You know, that song Heat of the Moment?
Yep.
John Wetton. This is him almost 10 years before. They have a violinist, David Cross, percussionist Jamie Muir, drummer Bill Bruford from Yes. And I don't even really need to talk about Bill Bruford's credentials, because if you listen to anything by Yes whatsoever, yeah, they're one of the most technical bands of this era. And prog rock is a technical genre, so that says a lot. Alongside Robert Fripp, the one consistent member of King Crimson and the mastermind behind the whole band's sound, on guitars. Right away, the most striking thing is how we have Bill Bruford, a grade A drummer by any stretch, by any metric, alongside a percussionist, Jamie Muir, who is credited with, and I quote the actual LP I have right here, percussion and all sorts. All sorts being just a variety of different instruments and just literally found objects. You can hear him banging on pots and pans, sheet metal. He even just tears some tin in front of the microphone at some point. And so right away, this band has got more of an improvisational feel, and that's what really drives this record for the most part. Coffee's good. But yeah, a striking feature of this record, of course, being that. And also a big thing, too, about King Crimson that defines them from a lot of these 70s progressive rock bands, their contemporaries, Genesis, Yes, Jethro Tull, Pink Floyd, is that they're always consistently darker and consistently more disturbing sounding. Which automatically, if you're a metal fan, pricks your ears up immediately. But Larks Tongues especially takes the mantle for being one of their most terrifying records for a variety of reasons, one of which only became really obvious to me when I heard the vinyl. Now, Isaac, I know I lent you the CD when I bought it of Larks Tongues, and that's an enhanced HD CD, like the new remasters. They did a really good job with those, but the vinyl of this thing was where it absolutely blew my fucking mind. The first track on the record, Larks Tongues and Aspic Part 1, because the track is an instrumental, it has two parts in this record. Part 1 starts off with a really calm intro with Jamie Muir pulling some kalimbas, African thumb pianos, and we got some other percussion in there, but it's a really kind of tranquil intro, whereupon we get David Cross on violin playing a kind of racing classical violin bridge, very much in minor key. Like it's the kind of thing you'd hear before a big chase scene or before a beast overtakes the main character kind of thing. Right before the whole band comes crashing in with Bruford and Muir pounding their instruments and Fripp and Wetton employing a ton of distortion. And on CD, that is absolutely cacophonous. Like, it is loud, it is heavy. I think I haven't found anything heavier from 73. And that's a year when Sabbath, Budgie, Led Zeppelin were all in their prime. I still haven't heard anything heavier than that. It's just the tone is not necessarily bludgeoning, it's just incendiary, like it's on fire. And then I heard the vinyl, and let me tell you, that drop hits so much harder on the vinyl. Like, I have to readjust my speakers when that comes on. Like, it's so freaking heavy, that riff. It just sounds so nasty, and the track does nothing predictable from that point on out. We get all this crazy offbeat jazz instrumentation, weird grooves. Fripp loves his minor tones on his guitar. He loves his weird jazz intervals. It just makes you uncomfortable in the best kind of way. And both parts of this instrumental are fantastic, but part one especially, for that huge riff and all the instrumentation that follows, right off to finishing with a very classy, almost ambient, slow violin solo by David Cross, and it sets a really different tone. It's such a cool intro. Like, I bet you can recall the exact moment you heard that for the first time too, Isaac.
Yeah, no, I certainly could. And I can hear, I don't know if this was ever influenced or if anybody was influenced. I think a lot of people were influenced, but I remember, I think with like that, the beginning with like the marimbas or whatever percussion that he was using there, I feel like I've heard that in either like a Nine Inch Nails album where he was, I don't know if he was going back to this specifically or if he was just happened upon it by coincidence and happenstance. But yeah, I definitely have heard marimbas have been used like, by anybody else, but just like I'm always wondering, like, was that cue used like later on by other people, or again just like coincidence?
Hard to say. Like, it's really hard to say who influenced who in music. There's so many different ways someone could come upon an idea, but I do know this is one of their more forward-thinking records. Like this one and Red, especially the third record released by an incarnation of this same lineup, is also seen as very influential on progressive metal as well. But this one in particular is where they kind of just completely threw everything at the wall and watched it stick. It is worth noting, though, that some parts of this record are a lot more experimental than others. Like, even though there's a general adventurous vibe to this record sonically, we have some more predictable stuff. Like, rounding off first side is The Book of Saturday, which is a quick little almost acoustic-y ballad with just Fripp playing guitar, John Wetton singing, and a bit of violin in the background. And it's less than 3 minutes long. It's a quick, nice little acoustic track. And then we have Exiles, which is a ballad very much in King Crimson's tradition. Some say vastly inferior to other great examples the band's already done, like Epitaph on Into the Court of the Crimson King. But Exiles, I think, carves its own unique niche because while its verses are very much what we'd expect from King Crimson, some nice drum beat, nice vocal melodies, mournful lyrics, there's this eerie mellotron bridge with all these found sounds that just creeps in and just seeks into every different part of the track, and it really gives it this desolate, eerie vibe that we kind of don't see anywhere else in their discography. And it's just really cool to hear a standard structure get punctuated by something just so out there, and that's what defines a lot of this record to me. Do you find this to be the most challenging King Crimson record, Isaac, that you've heard?
Good question. In challenging, how do you mean exactly?
In terms of, we all listened to In the Court of the Crimson King, and I think I can say beyond 21st Century Schizoid Man, which is the most kind of jazzy, furious track, a lot of that record is kind of easy to take by modern standards. Like, it tends to be a lot, not really breezy. It is a lot more calm, though. It's more chill. You know what I mean? But this one is a lot more inaccessible, I would say.
Yeah, it's a lot more. There's parts where for some time the instrumentation just lets loose and they don't like speak for a while. If I may ask you, do you think that with use of chord progression, or at least similar chords, is this like a whole album itself, or did they put all their eggs in like the first track and then the rest, as we have said beforehand, we'll do whatever we want with these? Like these are, I wouldn't say throwaway, of course. These guys do not like throwaway songs, but do you think the other tracks are just either experiments, or they're just like, all right, let's automatically do these?
So I think there's definitely a divide with this record. I mean, first of all, we've got, easy to say, there's 6 tracks, 3 are instrumental, 3 are not. That's pretty pretty clear cut. I do think the entire band was firing on more cylinders on the instrumentals. Like, I will say that outright. And a part of that is the band was taking on a more of an improvisational approach. Part of that due to percussionist Jamie Muir being very much a fan of improvisation and Fripp loving jazz, Bruford loving jazz. The band was leaning more in that improvised instrumental direction. So it's not surprising to see them absolutely shine on the three instrumentals. Both parts of Larks Tongues and Aspic, and the instrumental leading into part 2, the talking drum. It feels, that's one thing that's weird about that track, is the talking drum feels more like a build up to Larks Tongues and Aspic part 2. It has this repeating bass ostinato. For those who don't know classical music, and Isaac, if you recall deep in your classical terminology, ostinato is a stubborn, repetitive pattern that repeats throughout a song. So in this case, we have this rumbling bass line that keeps going, and gradually the entire band builds on it with guitars, violins, and different percussion until it hits a crescendo and climax with violin and guitar shrieking and goes right into the heavy, angry riff that starts Larks Tongues and Aspic part 2. So I will say I do think the instrumentals did get more attention. That being said, the inventiveness does spill into the other tracks, like Exiles with that wonderful Mellotron bridge. Easy Money too, while I don't think is particularly King Crimson's one of their stronger tracks, still has some really cool stuff. There's a nice breakdown in the middle where they get to instrumentally let loose. There's always some offbeat, dissonant chords going on, some cool melodies. Like, Wetton's a great vocalist. This isn't his best work. I feel like his voice is still developing here, but he still has a lot of charisma. He has a great voice. Like, listen to Heat of the Moment. He's a great bass vocalist too. Yeah, to answer your question, I do think more effort was put into the instrumentals here.
Yeah, thank you. That definitely makes sense. Length of the album itself, do you feel like is it overproduced at all, or do you think it goes on for too long, or is it just the right length?
It's great. I think 43 minutes for a prog record, especially from this time period, is about right. Like, a lot of prog albums tended to be kind of between that 40 and 50 minute range, some even actually shorter. I think it's totally fine because a lot of these are some really off the wall ideas for the time period, some a lot of experimental irregular structures. And so I think music that tends to be very extreme kind of in some cases is better shorter. Like check out Archspire. For those who don't know, Archspire, technical death metal band from Vancouver, very different genre, but my point being Archspire are very fast, very technical, and very kind of overwhelming because they're just full throttle the entire time. Kind of like Slayer's Rain and Blood, another great example of that thing. Rain and Blood remains about 29 minutes long, and Archspire doesn't usually do a record over 35 minutes because both those bands are aware that full throttle for that long is a lot to take for any listener. And so they keep it short because a lot of their ideas are either fast-paced or just insane. So in this case, it's helped by there's a lot of ponderous moments, like that last half of the first instrumental. The talking drum is largely pretty breezy listen, except for that absolute like bitch slap you get at the very end when it decides to climax. But for the most part, this is a pretty easy to take experimental record, I would say.
My question is, would you recommend this before? No. I was like, would you recommend this before Court of the Crimson King?
No. And the Court of the Crimson King is probably the best place to enter King Crimson. Like, it's their namesake. But this is an easy second place to start because a lot of the albums in between in the Court of the Crimson King and this one, while they're all really good, and once again, you could talk about a lot of them, this one is kind of the next bold statement the band make. Like, In the Wake of Poseidon, great, but a lot of it is still very much in the style of the record before it, and the record before it tends to do a lot of that stuff better. Lizard is great too, but it's very jazzy, and it's not quite as, I don't think it's quite as strong. Its peaks aren't as strong as this one. Islands, honestly, I don't think is that great a record. This, or I would say not the one immediately after it, but there's the last one with this lineup, Red. Between Red and the Court of the Crimson King, those are probably your best starting points for this band because those are more what you're used to, and then you can dig out the more experimental stuff afterwards. What do you find to be the most standout thing about this record, Isaac?
If I had to, it's that violin. Violin is just persistent. Like, obviously, all the instruments are persistent throughout, but I guess the fact that with Court of the Crimson King, one of the things, the underlying themes for that is that flute. That flute, like, really made that record for me. I was surprised how much it was involved in that. And this violin, again, even though, you've heard violins in other productions, but this one, I don't know why, it was very persistent throughout, and I liked how it stood alongside all the other instruments. I think the other thing that really was, like a slap in the face, as you said, is the end of that like talking drum where, like you said, the ostinato just finally ascends into that like crescendo and then goes like FF, and I'm definitely, was a shock to the system.
And the other thing too about this record that makes it kind of more easy to take in a way is that King Crimson wouldn't even release anything quite like this. The follow-up, Starless and Bible Black, well, they had one less member. It's interesting. From this record to Red, they kind of had one less member every time. So Jamie Muir, the percussionist, if you hear a sound in this record it's kind of weird, it's probably Jamie Muir banging on something weird. He's the first one to leave the band after this, for Starless and Bible Black. But for Starless, they kind of had more of that improvisational take still, and a lot of those songs were improvised or recorded in a live setting. And then they lose David Cross on violin, leaving just Fripp, Wetton, and Bruford for Red. So Larks Tongues is still kind of an anomaly in their discog, because it's this in-between them firing on all cylinders and them being really adventurous. Like, you can tell they couldn't have made Starless or Red without this record. But it's also the only one of its kind in their discography. And even though they would explore the having more than one drummer thing in the future, like when we saw them, I think it was in 2017 or 2018, they were touring with a 3-drummer lineup. And part 1, Larks Tongues and Aspic, sounded incredible with 3 drummers. It was absolutely insane. But it's also made even more special by the fact that there was nothing kind of like this. Like, this was 73. You think about what hasn't come out by then. Like, this predates the entirety of progressive metal. This predates the punk movement. This kind of predates what everyone would soon be calling post-punk experimentation, avant-garde, all that stuff. I think that even makes it more exceptional because it's just still so out there. This is also the first album where they don't have the lyricist Peter Sinfield, too. And for a while, King Crimson had that kind of unofficial member, Sinfield, who was writing a lot of the lyrics. And he's responsible for a lot of the fantasy-tinged and kind of medieval-tinged lyrics in The Court of the Crimson King and the albums after it. So this time it feels like they've kind of come away from that initial fantasy and medieval progressive rock stuff and have kind of gone to everyday life a bit more. And that's why it's kind of more present and more terrifying in a lot of ways. Wraps up most of my thoughts on this thing. Isaac, what are your thoughts?
I got nothing else other than like I highly recommend this album to anybody interested, or who, if any of those words that he has said pique your interest, please go. I highly recommend this album that you would listen to it, because I don't know how well I'm doing to tell you to listen to it, but it's definitely an experience.
It is. Any King Crimson album is an experience, and this is maybe not the best place to start, but it's up there. It's definitely on the need-to-have list from that band's discography. You can't go wrong with the King Crimson album, and this is no exception, but this is probably their most experimental from their classic period, and you will have a great time with it. You'll hear a lot of things that a lot of bands since then have done in trying to impersonate it, but it's still kind of in a league of its own for its time period. It's worth checking out. After the release of Larks Tongues and Aspic, King Crimson's lineup would deteriorate even further, with them losing a 1 band member per record and gradually becoming more and more unstable, but still releasing excellent work, culminating in the release of Red in 1974, after which the band would break up. For the next 8 years anyway, as Fripp would soon come back with a new, revitalized lineup and an even crazier sound with Discipline. We'll come back to the world of King Crimson soon enough, because there's a lot to discuss here and a lot to pour over, and no shortage of fantastic listening experiences. But for now, we'll close the door on this one, and everybody else have a good rest of your day.